apologise if some of what I say tonight is material you already know. But I thought I'd better start with the basics, otherwise, you know, I just can't assume that you know stuff about what happened, for example, in the 1980s, when I was an undergraduate. So John Paul II, the milestones of his life. First of all, he was born in May of 1920, the son of an Austro-Hungarian army officer and a school teacher. So his mum was a school teacher, and his father was an officer in the army of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, otherwise known as Emperor Karol or Emperor Charles, who was later beatified by St. John Paul II. And St. John Paul II was named Karol, or Karl, or the Polish version of Charles or Karl, after the emperor, apparently, because his father was serving in the emperor's army. But his father was also named Karol. So I think there's a double reason that he ended up getting named Karol. But Poland, for some 123 years, was not a political entity. It was a cultural entity, but Poland had been chopped up by the three superpowers. The Russians controlled the territory around Warsaw and to the east of Warsaw. The Prussians controlled the territory on the western borders of Poland with Germany, and the southern bit, which takes in Krakow, which is one of the two greatest cities in Poland. That area was part of the Austro-Hungarian territory. So that's how come his dad was an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, not in the Polish army. But in 1918, Poland obtained independence at the end of the First World War. So by the time that Wojtyła was born in 1920, Poland was an independent country, had been so just for 2 years. He was the youngest of 3 children, but his sister Olga only survived a few hours, so he never knew his sister. She died on the day of her birth. And he had an older brother called Edmund, who was 13 when Karol was born, but Edmund died when Karol was only 12 years old. So for those first 12 years of his life, he had an older brother, but his older brother became a doctor, and he caught scarlet fever from one of his patients, and so died as a very young man. Also, when the young Pope John Paul II was only 8 years old, he lost his mother. She died of a heart attack. And in 1941, when he was only 20 years old, his father died of a heart attack. So by the time he was 20 years old, by the time of his 21st birthday, he had no grandparents, no parents, no siblings. So as he was growing up, he had to deal with, the loss of people he loved very deeply, and that had an impact upon his spiritual development. In 1938, he went to the famous Jagiellonian University in Krakow. The Jagiellonian is like the Polish Oxford. It's a medieval university, and it was founded by Queen Jadwiga Jagiello, hence the name the Jagiellonian University. And Jadwiga had complications in childbirth and died soon after. But when she died, she left most of her estate for the foundation of a university. So if you can imagine that, she was a Polish queen, great Catholic lady, and when she's dying, she says, I want my wealth to be put to the use of the building of a university. And so that becomes the Jagiellonian University. It's one of the great institutions of Polish society. So he goes to the Jagiellonian and he studies philology, which is the study of language. Now, overall, he learned, in the course of his life, some 15 languages. And they were Polish, Latin, Italian, English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Luxembourgish, which is some kind of strange mixture of German and French and Walloon and other dialects, Dutch, Ukrainian, Serbo-Croatian, Czech, Slovak and Esperanto. Okay, so that's his list of languages, as well as when he was studying theology, he did a bit of Hebrew as well. And he had an extraordinary ability to communicate. You know, when he later became Pope and he was flying around the world, you know, he could often speak to people in their own language, or at least give a small amount of his homily in the language of the country he was visiting. So 1938, he goes to university. 1939, of course, World War II breaks out. And one of the things that happens at that time is that over 100 of the professors at the Jagiellonian are rounded up and taken off to concentration camps. And I've actually been to the room at the Jagiellonian University where the Nazis had them kind of all gathered up before they went off to the concentration camps. The Nazis had a policy of decapitating Polish society. They wanted to just round up anyone who was a leader in Polish society. And so one of the first places they went was to the Jagiellonian University to take away the professors. The Poles, however, have had a history of what are called flying universities. And this concept of a flying university began when many of the Polish people were under the governance of Russia, and they wanted to study aspects of Polish culture. They set up their own underground university. And that first underground university that the Poles established produced the great chemist and Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie. If any of you have come across the name Marie Curie, she was a Pole and she studied in one of these underground universities. So during the Second World War, the Poles do the same thing. They set up underground universities. St. John Paul II continues his studies, but he also has to become a manual labourer. And he ends up going to work in a limestone quarry. So for those war years, 1940 to 1944, for most of that time he's involved in all kinds of manual labouring work. During that time he has 2 accidents. I don't know how he managed to do this, but on one occasion he was hit by a tram, and on another occasion he was hit by a truck. And he survived both of those accidents. And he took that as a bit of a sign that God probably wanted him to live for a particular purpose. If you ever go to Krakow, you will see that the whole inner city of Krakow has little trams, and they're a lot quieter than our trams. And you really have to look out for them because they don't make very much noise. So if you were walking along and absorbed in thought, you could easily kind of become absent-minded and, you know, find yourself being hit by one of the trams. I don't know if that is what happened, but I can imagine that happening. So he has two significant accidents and survives both of them. Also during this period, he begins to be influenced by a layman called Jan Tyranovsky, who was gathering people together to teach Carmelite spirituality and also to form what was called living rosary groups. So people would come, much like you've come tonight, they would come to meetings, and this man would talk about Carmelite spirituality. And when people left, they promised to say particular decades of the rosary, so that, you know, somebody would be given the first decade, somebody else the second, and so on. So he was a part of that spiritual circle, and that also had a big impact upon his spiritual development. And for the rest of his life, he maintained a very strong Carmelite spirituality. And when he goes to Rome to study, he studies the work of St. John of the Cross, who was a great Carmelite mystic. So these years of the Second World War are, of course, absolutely horrific years in Poland, and he basically survives during that time. In 1942, the height of the war, he decides that it's definitely his vocation to be a priest. That had not been his first idea. When he was a student in secondary school, he thought of being an actor. He really wanted to be an actor. But there's a story that Cardinal Adam Sapieha, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, visited the young Karol Wojtyła's school and saw him perform, and said to one of his teachers, "Who is that boy and what does he want to do when he leaves school?" And the response was, "Oh, that's, you know, Karol Wojtyła, he wants to be an actor." And Sapieha's response was, "A pity, he'd make a great priest." And then in 1942, having had, you know, all of these dramatic experiences during the Second World War, and having become part of this Carmelite spirituality group, he presented himself to Cardinal Sapieha and said he wanted to become a priest. He told Sapieha that he wanted to become a Carmelite priest, and Sapieha said, "No, you're becoming a diocesan priest." So he enters an underground seminary. Sapieha protects him, guards him, you know, really tries to keep him protected from the Nazis. And then in 1946, he's ordained to the priesthood. And then the following year, he's sent to Rome to do his licentiate in theology, and he manages to do that in 1 year. Most people take 2, he did it in 1. And then he does his doctorate. Again, he takes 1 year to do his doctorate. Most people take 2 to 4. So in Rome, he is at the Angelicum University, which is the Dominican university. And he studies there under one of the Angelicum's most famous professors, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. So he's in Rome for 2 years. During that time in Italy, he goes and has a meeting with Padre Pio. Have you all heard of Padre Pio? And Padre Pio told him that one day you will hold the highest post in the church. And it said at the time that he thought that probably meant that he might become a cardinal. So after 2 years in Rome, he returns to Poland, and he's given the parish of St. Florian, which has a strong association with the university. He lectures at the Agolonian in ethics, and he also lectures at the Catholic University of Lublin in ethics. The Catholic University of Lublin is located on the eastern part of Poland in the north, very close to the Ukrainian border. And during the communist era, it was the only Catholic institution of higher education allowed to operate in the entire communist bloc, the only one anywhere in the communist bloc. So he's a lecturer both at the Catholic University of Lublin and at the Agolonian, and he organises a student group, much like your own. And at that time, because communism has arrived, and I'll get to communism in a minute, but by 1949, when he's a parish priest at St. Florian's and he's developing this youth group, the communists start trying to destroy the faith of the Polish people, and they don't actually allow priests to take youth on camps. It wasn't allowed because they didn't want priests influencing young people. So he would still go with the young people up into the mountains, in particular up into the Tatra Mountains, which is depicted here. And they'd go camping in the summer, they would go skiing in the winter, and he would say Mass and give homilies, give catechetical talks to the young people, and so that the police wouldn't arrest him, he would wear non-clerical clothes, and he would ask the youth to call him Wujek, which means uncle. So he was called Uncle, just in case some local plod overheard. So this is really quite significant, this period in his life, because he's working with a lot of young people, and he's seeing a lot of courtship behaviour. He is seeing people, become couples, get married, starting families together, and that gives him both a great interest in the subject of marriage and family life, but it also gives him a lot of personal pastoral experience in that field, and that becomes significant for later as well. 1953, he completes an Habilitatioenschrift at the Agolonian. In Europe, or at least in some of the countries in Europe, it's not enough just to get a doctorate. Once you've got your doctorate, you have to get what's called an Habilitatioenschrift. Well, it's called doing your habilitation, and it's a second thesis which qualifies you to be a teacher in a university. So if you're in Germany, you have a doctorate, you're still a nobody. You have to do this Habilitatioenschrift. And until very recently, it was the same in Poland. I was there a few years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, and there were discussions about maybe dropping the requirement of the Habilitatioenschrift. I'm not sure what's happened there, but certainly in 1953 it was necessary if you wanted to be a professor at a university. So he does the Habilitatioenschrift, again in the subject of ethics. 1958, he's made an auxiliary bishop of Krakow. 1959, he says midnight mass in an open field in the town of Nowa Huta. Now, Nowa Huta is a terrible place that was built by the communists to be an industrial town, a steel town, and it was famous for the fact that it was not to have a church. And so you have, if you can imagine, a whole town full of people who work producing steel, and they're not allowed to have a church. And so what Wojtyła does is to invite people to midnight mass in an open field, and it becomes the beginning of a battle he has with the communists over their policy of no church in the town of Nova Huta. He eventually wins that battle. Early 1960s, of course, we have the Second Vatican Council, which he attends, and he has a significant input into two documents, Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae. We can talk about that some more. 1964, he's made the Archbishop of Krakow. 1967, he's made a cardinal. 1967, he also advises Pope Paul VI about the issue of contraception. And the fact that Paul VI decided the way he did on the subject of contraception was strongly influenced by some articles that Karol Wojtyła had wrote to Paul VI. I don't think he had much influence, if any, on the actual drafting of the document that became Humanae Vitae, but I think he had a significant impact upon the reasoning of Pope Paul VI. Then in 1978, he's elected to the papacy, and in 1979 he returns home to Poland for the first time as Pope, which was an absolutely historic moment in the life of Poland. And by this time, Poland had been, had a couple of decades of having to endure a communist government. And he returns to Poland, and that visit to Poland begins the destruction of communism in Europe. It takes another decade to actually get to the point where communism is destroyed in Europe, but that trip to Poland in 1979 was the beginning of the process of the destruction of communism. And so I now want to turn to talking a little bit about communism and his role in the destruction of Polish communism, because again, your generation missed out on communism, which is good for you. But if you haven't lived through it, then maybe you don't know a lot about it. So this little section of the talk will be about communism. So in the 20th century, communist governments were responsible for the death of some 94 million people. This can be broken down to 65 million in China, 20 million in the Soviet Union, 2 million in Cambodia, 2 million in North Korea, 1.7 million in Africa, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, 1 million in the communist states of Eastern Europe, 150,000 in Latin America, and some 10,000 deaths resulting from actions of the international communist movement not in power. These statistics include the intentional destruction of whole populations by starvation and deaths resulting from deportations, physical confinement, and forced labour. So 94 million people in the 20th century. Communism is an ideology built on the ideas of the 19th century German philosopher Karl Marx. The opening words of Marx's book, The Communist Manifesto, were "Workers of the world unite. The history of the world is the history of class struggle." Marx's thesis was that class struggle is the driver of human history, and that progress comes about when technological development gives rise to new social classes, which overthrow the previously dominant social class. Thus, Marx argued that the European bourgeoisie, the middle class, rose to power with the Industrial Revolution and overthrew the old aristocracy in the French Revolution and became itself the ruling class. The historic role of the industrial proletariat was now to wage a class war against the bourgeoisie, eliminate all private property, and bring to birth a new world order that was to be called communism. This was to be the highest stage of human development, a purely classless society in which people would hunt in the morning, fish after lunch, and philosophise after dinner. In other words, there'd be no having one job, but you could do something in the morning, something different in the afternoon, and something different again in the evening. Marx was also an atheist who had been influenced by the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach argued that people believe in God as a psychological crutch. They create a God for themselves because they cannot cope emotionally with the idea that there is no God, no ultimate justice, no eternal life. Marx believed that it would be necessary to free the proletarian workers of their attachment to Christianity if they were to perform their historic role of waging war against the bourgeoisie and bringing the order of communism to birth. So class war and atheism were the two key hallmarks of communism. In the early 20th century, Marx's ideas became popular with Russian revolutionaries who in October 1917 murdered the Russian royal family and effected a military coup under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. This is usually known as the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, since the name Bolshevik means the majority in Russian, and this is what the revolutionaries called themselves. Following a series of wars between the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, and their enemies, known as the Whites, a number of neighbouring lands to Russia were annexed under Bolshevik control. What was Russia became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, or Soviet Union. Within the USSR, the practice of religion was suppressed, churches were destroyed, and atheism was taught in all the schools. Those who spoke out against this found themselves in concentration camps known as gulags. One of those neighbouring lands the Red Army tried to conquer was Poland. The Red Army invaded Poland in 1918, but it was defeated in 1920 on the Feast of the Assumption in what is called the Battle of Warsaw, or sometimes the Miracle on the Wisła. The Wisła is the river that runs through the centre of Warsaw. No one expected the Poles to beat the Red Army. So certain were foreign powers of a Polish defeat that all the embassies in Warsaw retreated. They withdrew all of their personnel except the Holy See. The papal nuncio, Monsignor Achilleratti, the future Pope Pius XI, was the only ambassador to remain at his post. Pope Benedict XV called on Catholics throughout the world to pray for the Poles, and on August 6th, the Poles themselves began a novena to Our Lady. 9 days later, on the Feast of the Assumption, they not only defeated, but actually routed the Red Army, and the Poles were left unmolested by the Soviets for another 19 years. In the accounts of the Battle of Warsaw, reference is always made to the fact that troops believed they were seeing visions of Our Lady in the sky. And in some of the reports, it's only the Russians who see Our Lady. Now, I've asked myself the question, why is it that in some of the reports, only the Russians were alleged to have seen Our Lady? My theory is that if the Poles saw her, they might have decided that she was there for them and they didn't have to do anything. So that's one possible theory. But in any event, it is a historical fact that members of the Red Army believed they had seen a vision of the Virgin Mary over the capital of Warsaw, and they were just really terrified by that and started to retreat. But it's also acknowledged that the Polish general, Joseph Pilsudski, was tactically brilliant, that he crept up from the Red Army, he crept up on the Red Army from behind, and the Poles also managed to capture Soviet code books, which was, of course, a big strategic advantage for them. After the victory, Pope Benedict XV wrote a letter to the Primate of Poland saying that the power of prayer had saved the rampart of Europe, all Christianity and civilization. If Poland had fell, then it would just be a domino effect. The Bolsheviks returned to Russia undefeated, but one strange historical fact is that they took with them the body of the Jesuit saint Andrew Bobola. They stole his body from a church in Warsaw and took it back to Moscow for medical analysis, since the body of Saint Andrew is one of those bodies of saints that have remained inexplicably incorrupt. You know how sometimes saints' bodies don't decompose? Well, Saint Andrew Bobola was one of those. And it was decades before Vatican diplomats managed to get St. Andrew's body back. So in that period of the 1920s, they managed to keep the communists out of Poland. However, on September 1st, 1939, when the young Karol was just 19 years old, Poland was invaded from the west by Nazi Germany, and on September 17, some 2 weeks later, from the east by the Soviets. On October 8, Germany annexed western Poland and the former city of Danzig, now known as Gdansk. And at the same time, the Soviet Union immediately started a campaign of Sovietization of its newly acquired areas in the east of Poland. This included staged elections, the result of which were used to legitimize the Soviet Union's annexation of eastern Poland. Some significant numbers of Polish officers did manage to escape to Britain, where they joined up with the British forces and contributed to the Battle of Britain and to the development of the Royal Navy's sonar system for submarines. The Poles who got to the UK were massively helpful. First of all, fighting in the British Air Force. Secondly, helping the Navy to develop a sonar system, and they were also brilliant code breakers and contributed significantly to the breaking of the German codes. Britain, in fact, joined the Second World War because of the Nazi invasion of Poland. But at a conference in the Crimean town of Yalta in 1945, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the British leader Winston Churchill, and the American leader President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed that after the war, Poland would become part of the Soviet bloc. As a result, from 1945 to 1989, Poland was a communist country, or what was then called a captive nation, as these countries that fell on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall became known. Churchill did eventually admit that he'd made a grave error. One might say it was his biggest since Gallipoli. A year after the Yalta Agreement in 1946, he gave a famous speech in which he said that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. Karol Wojtyła found himself on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. At the time of his election to the papacy in 78, the Polish Communist government was preparing a propaganda campaign about a Polish cosmonaut who had been working with the Soviet space program. They were intending to highlight the benefits of the Polish relationship with the Soviets by reference to how good it was to have a cosmonaut as a national icon. However, the election of a Polish pope ended all of that. Wojtyła eclipsed the cosmonaut. As the cardinals went forward to congratulate the new pope, and one by one fell to their knees and kissed his ring, the Polish people were treated to the spectacle of a new pontiff himself falling to his knees to embrace the Cardinal Archbishop of Warsaw, Stefan Wyszyński. Wyszyński had been a prisoner of the communists between 1953 and 1956. And it was, again, sorry about the cliche, but it was an iconic moment when you have this Polish Pope just dropping to his knees and throwing his arms around the shoulders of the Cardinal Archbishop of Warsaw, a man who had been imprisoned by the communists. And it was a moment which I think just gave the Polish people so much hope. And today, if you go to the Catholic University of Lublin, there's a statue in the gardens there of Wyszyński and Wojtyła embracing at that moment. Wyszyński had organised what was called the Decade of the Great Novena, and from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, there was a novena in Poland where what Wyszyński had hoped would happen was that the image of the Black Madonna, the most famous Marian image in Poland, would be taken around the villages of Poland. And the communists opposed this. And so Wyszyński said, right, you won't let us take the image of the Madonna around the villages of Poland. We will take a frame around the villages of Poland. And so Wojtyła had his priests going around with, a frame, an empty frame, to the different villages. And it just showed the communists up for being the thugs that they were. And there's a whole lecture that could be given on Wyszyński and how he dealt with the communists at that time, and crazy things like communist police guarding the monastery of Jasna Gora to make sure that the image of Our Lady didn't get out of the monastery, and people leaving the monastery after Mass having their cars searched by the police to make sure that they didn't have an image of Our Lady in their car. All sorts of crazy stuff. But that's also part of the backstory to St. John Paul II. It is difficult to overstate how dramatic a moment his election was. It was a gesture that spoke volumes to the millions of Poles watching it on television. Suddenly the Poles were no longer a wretched bunch of people sandwiched between communist-controlled East Germany on the one side and the communist Ukraine on the other, a nation demoralised by the loss of the best and brightest of a generation, its betrayal by the Western powers, and its impotence to defend itself against the might of the Soviet Union. They now had an advocate on the world stage, and one who was a particularly charming personality. To use a Harry Potter metaphor, one might say that the communists comported themselves like dementors. They operated by sucking the hope out of people. No individual could stand against them and win. It would take an entire nation to collectively resist. And after the horror of the Second World War, and after spending hours of every day standing in food queues and living with 3 generations in a 2-bedroom apartment, after the food shortages, the medical shortages, and so on, there wasn't a lot of energy left for political opposition. But the election of Wojtyła to the papacy gave the Polish people hope. They stopped feeling abandoned and powerless. In June of 1979, Pope John Paul II returned to Poland, and literally millions of Poles listened to his speeches and took to heart his message, "Be not afraid." The then US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was later to say that all of a sudden the Polish people discovered that they all shared the same aspiration, the same resentments, and the regime, the communist regime, discovered that it was weak and isolated. In his recollection of the events of June 1979, the former Solidarity advisor Adam Michnik has described this moment in history as a time of three Polish miracles. First, John Paul II returns triumphantly to Poland as Pope, making a mockery of Stalin's jibe about the Pope having no military divisions. Then the second miracle occurs a little more than a year later in August 1980, when Lech Wałęsa leads the shipyard strike and the first non-communist trade union movement is formed within the Soviet bloc and named Solidarity. And the third miracle occurs some 2 months later when the Polish writer-poet Czesław Miłosz is awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So there is a turning point, and Wojtyła begins this decade-long struggle to liberate the people of Central Europe and Eastern Europe and ultimately Russia itself from communism. I've just got about a page and a half, is that okay? All right. Throughout the 1980s, the treatment of such themes as freedom, courage, human authenticity, and human dignity in John Paul II's literary and philosophical works were popularised by the chaplains of the trade union movement known as Solidarity. And this included the philosopher Joseph Tischner, who was author of the book The Spirit of Solidarity, and it also included Father Jerzy Popowuszko, whose speeches were broadcast over Radio Free Europe. Father Popowuszko, who was one of the chaplains to Solidarity, was so influential that in October 1984 he was dragged from his car by members of the secret police, beaten up and drowned in the Wisła River. Some 250,000 people attended his funeral, and news of this tragedy heightened Western awareness of the brutality of the communist regime. And in June 2010, Father Popowuszko was beatified by Pope Benedict XVI. But in the 1980s, the murder of one of the chaplains to Solidarity, it just had the effect not only of increasing the determination of the Polish people to oppose the communists, but also increasing the determination of the Western powers to help the people in the Soviet bloc to resist. During much of this decade, from 1979 to 1989, the Polish people existed under a condition of martial law imposed by General Jaruzelski. He justified his behaviour by claiming that the imposition of martial law was better than having a Soviet occupation of Poland. In other words, it's better to be oppressed by members of the Polish Communist Party than having Russian communists occupy Poland. There was a decade of political manoeuvring between the increasingly powerless Communist Party members and the increasingly bold and strategically shrewd Solidarity members, who were aided and abetted by Polish exiles and people of goodwill throughout the Western world. At the time of the declaration of martial law in 1981, students and trade unionists in Western countries, including Australia, took to the streets waving Solidarity banners bearing the words, "Let Poland be Poland." It was no longer an isolated Polish fight, but under St. John Paul II, it became fashionable for people outside of Polish circles to champion the efforts of Solidarity to make Poland a free country. At the same time, Wojtyła used the papacy as a platform from which to heighten world interest in the problems of all the other countries caught within the Soviet zone of influence. American leaders also made sure that the Vatican diplomatic service was kept well informed of US intelligence on Soviet strategy vis-à-vis Poland. On May 13, 1981, John Paul II survived an assassination attempt by a Turkish gunman who had links to the Bulgarian secret police. He was on his way to open the first John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family at the Pontifical Lateran University when the shooting took place. Although the KGB denied any involvement, it was widely believed that the Soviet government was using one of its surrogates to rid itself of the problem of an anti-communist pope. John Paul II survived the assassination attempt and attributed his recovery to Our Lady of Fatima. The bullet seemed to change its trajectory and miraculously miss vital organs as it entered the Pope's body. When his post-operative care was not going well, a medical professor at the University of Edinburgh spoke to one of the Dominican chaplains at the university and said, "I don't think that the Italian doctors are doing the right thing. This is what I would recommend." The Dominican put the professor in contact with the Pope's doctors through the papal nuncio's office. His advice was followed and St. John Paul II recovered, which is a moral about, how chaplaincies are so important at universities. The Poles finally achieved freedom in August 1989 when the communists permitted Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a member of Solidarity, to take over as Prime Minister. The fall of communism in Poland had a domino effect in neighbouring captive nations, and the Berlin Wall, the starkest symbol of the Iron Curtain, was itself torn down on November 9, 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last of the Soviet leaders, was later to say, "The collapse of the Iron Curtain would have been impossible without John Paul II." So that is the end of my lecture for tonight. I've tried to give you a sort of potted history of his life, plus sort of some details about the background to the man and his experiences during the Second World War and during the period of communism in Poland, and his work to destroy communism in Europe. But there's so many other areas we can talk about next week, because he's not a man who had just one achievement. He had about 20 achievements. So we can look at his intellectual work, we can look at his work on sexual ethics, the theology of marriage, we can look at his ecumenical work, we could look at the work he did for in the context of Catholic-Jewish relations. In so many different fields, he had a monumental impact, and for that reason, there are many people who refer to him as St. John Paul the Great. But we can talk about some of his other achievements in the lecture next week.